Phones were screaming. Not just ringing, but screaming a high, unified siren of pure panic. Beyond the glass walls of the corner office, the trading floor was a sea of red, a digital hemorrhage spreading across 1,000 screens. The impossible was happening. The giants were falling. For the hedge fund manager watching the meltdown, the world had tilted off its axis. Hours earlier, he had done the responsible thing. He saw the storm on the horizon and risked wiring back the hundreds of millions of dollars his fund had borrowed. The loan was settled. Now, he was on the phone, trying to get his collateral back. The $2 billion in pristine, ultra-safe government bonds his fund had posted as a guarantee. The call was a battle against an army of automated messages and junior assistants. But finally, a voice came on the line. It wasn't his usual contact. It was someone from the prime broker's risk department, and his tone was unnervingly calm. The manager explained the situation. The loan was repaid. The collateral should be released to his account immediately. The voice on the other end paused, a brief, calculated silence that felt like an eternity. "We acknowledge receipt of your wire," the voice said, devoid of any emotion. "However, there will be a delay in the segregation and return of your collateral assets." A delay? The manager felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "What kind of delay? Those are my firm's assets. They belong to my clients." The voice on the phone remained steady, almost patronizing. "Sir, as per your financing agreement, the assets were not held in segregation. They have been utilized. It is a standard component of our collateral financing and liquidity framework, a way to enhance capital efficiency for all parties involved." Utilized. Repledged. Capital efficiency. The jargon was a smokescreen, a legalistic fog designed to obscure a terrifying reality. His bonds, his clients' assets, were gone. They hadn't been stolen, not in the technical sense. They had been taken, with permission granted by a single clause buried on page 147 of a contract, and used by the bank for its own purposes. The bank had taken his bonds and pledged them as collateral for its own loans from another bank. That bank, in turn, may have lent them to someone else, who may have pledged them again, creating a dizzying, invisible chain of claims and obligations all stacked on top of the same single asset. His $2 billion in bonds were now supporting perhaps $10 billion in leverage across the global system. And now, the bank at the center of this web was collapsing. The chain was snapping, link by catastrophic link. His assets, his client's property, were vaporizing into the black hole of counterparty failure. This wasn't an isolated phone call. In September of 2008, this same chilling conversation was happening in thousands of offices around the world. Investors, funds, and even other banks were waking up to the fact that the assets they thought were safely parked with their brokers had vanished. It was a magic trick on a global scale. How could one asset be in multiple places at once? This mechanism, this financial sleight of hand that supercharged the global financial system with hidden leverage, has a name. It is not fraud. It is not, strictly speaking, theft. It is a perfectly legal, globally accepted and critically important practice known as rehypothecation. It turns a simple pledge of collateral into a complex web of interconnected risk, allowing a single dollar to act as if it exists in 3, 5, or even 10 places at once. Each time the asset is repledged, a new layer of credit and leverage is created out of thin air, built upon the same, single foundation. When markets are calm, this financial alchemy generates enormous profits and lubricates the gears of the global economy. But when the foundation cracks, the entire inverted pyramid of leverage built upon it comes crashing down. What happened in 2008 was the catastrophic failure of the system on an unprecedented scale. The collapse of Lehman Brothers wasn't just the failure of one bank. It was the implosion of a central node in this global web of rehypothecation. Trillions of dollars in assets were frozen, their ownership suddenly impossible to determine. It was a financial heart attack, and the world's economy went into cardiac arrest. To understand how our modern financial world truly works, and the hidden risks that lie just beneath its surface, we must understand this process. It is the story of how your assets, sitting in a brokerage account, might not be where you think they are. The story of rehypothecation is a gateway to understanding the true hidden architecture of modern money, a world of abstract contracts and invisible leverage that has immense real-world power. If you value this kind of deep dive analysis and believe that knowledge is the first step towards navigating our complex world, subscribe now so you never miss another expose. To truly grasp the danger, we must see it not as an abstract concept, but as a battle between two opposing philosophies, embodied by two players in the great game. On one side we have David Chen, the founder of a boutique hedge fund, Keystone Capital. Chen was a man forged in the fire of past crises. He'd had a front-row seat to the dot-com implosion, watching fortunes built on pure narrative evaporate overnight. His entire strategy was built on a single unwavering principle: capital preservation. His clients weren't chasing lottery tickets. They were pension funds, endowments, and families who had entrusted him with their future. For Chen, owning an asset meant controlling it. It was simple, tangible, and safe. On the other side was not a person but an entity. Goliath Global Bank, a titan of finance, a sprawling empire of interconnected trading desks, investment arms, and, crucially, a prime brokerage division. This division was the bank's engine room, providing the loans, leverage, and plumbing for hundreds of hedge funds like Keystone. For Goliath, an asset sitting idle was a wasted opportunity. Their philosophy was one of relentless efficiency. Every dollar, every bond, every share had to be working, constantly moving, generating fees and securing cheaper funding. To Goliath, Chen's desire for control was an inefficiency, a friction in their perfectly calibrated money-making machine. The collision of these two worlds began, as it always does, with a contract. In his modest office, years before the crisis, Chen was hunched over Goliath's prime brokerage agreement. It was a document thicker than a phone book, a fortress of legal jargon. His lawyer had already flagged the key section: collateral management. The language was broad, granting Goliath the right to use, pledge, repledge, hypothecate, rehypothecate, lend, or otherwise utilize any assets posted as collateral. Chen pushed back. In a sterile conference call with Goliath's legal team, he argued for a hard limit, a cap on how much of his collateral could be reused. The voice on the other end was smooth, patient, but unyielding. David, this is market standard. It's what allows us to offer you the most competitive financing rates. Restricting our ability to manage collateral efficiently would mean a higher cost of capital for you. It was a veiled threat wrapped in the language of customer service. To get access to Goliath's platform, Chen had to accept their terms. He signed, but the clause felt like a splinter under his skin. A few years later, the market was roaring. The machine was working perfectly. Chen received a call from his relationship manager at Goliath, a cheerful, aggressive salesman named Marcus. David, great quarter. Listen, we're rolling out a new enhanced financing program. We can shave another 30 basis points off your borrowing costs. All it requires is a minor amendment to the collateral agreement, just giving us a bit more flexibility. Chen's eyes narrowed. More flexibility meant more rehypothecation. It meant Goliath could take even more of his clients' assets and use them for their own book. Thanks, Marcus, but we're comfortable with our current arrangement. We don't need the extra leverage. The line went quiet for a beat. Your call, David. Just leaving money on the table, Marcus said, the cheerfulness in his voice replaced by a flicker of annoyance. The first real tremor came during a routine audit. Chen sat with his firm's independent auditor, a meticulous woman who missed nothing. She slid a statement from Goliath across the table, her finger resting on a single line buried in the footnotes: client assets available for rehypothecation. The number was staggering, far larger than Chen had mentally accounted for. The auditor was calm. They're within the limits of the agreement you signed, David. Legally, it's our tight. But Chen felt a chill. The number wasn't static. It had been growing each year. As his fund grew, so did the pool of assets Goliath could use. He was the legal owner, but he was losing effective control. He realized he was no longer just a client of Goliath. His fund's entire $2 billion asset base had become a component in Goliath's vast, opaque funding apparatus. His safe, boring government bonds weren't sitting in a vault with his name on them. They were out in the world, moving at the speed of light, underpinning the risks and bets of countless other players he would never know. The splinter under his skin was beginning to ache. The final act began not with a bang, but with a rumor. A whisper on the wire that a rival bank was refusing to roll over its short-term Goliath. For the market, it was the first sign of blood in the water. For David Chen, it was a fire alarm. He immediately began the process of unwinding his fund's leverage. He sold positions, raised cash, and initiated a wire transfer to Goliath, paying back every cent he had borrowed. It was a clean, simple transaction. Loan repaid. Now, he just needed his collateral back. He sent a formal request through the portal, return of all Keystone Capital assets from the collateral account. An automated message popped up. Request received. Processing. Hours passed. Then, a day. The market was now in a full-blown panic. Goliath's stock price was in freefall. Chen was on the phone constantly, trying to get a straight answer. Marcus, his cheerful relationship manager, was no longer answering his calls. He was routed through a labyrinth of departments until he finally reached a senior executive in the prime brokerage unit. The man's voice was strained, exhausted. David, we're dealing with unprecedented market dislocations. There are operational delays across the board. Chen's patience snapped. This isn't an operational delay. I repaid the loan. The agreement is terminated. You have no legal claim to my assets. Where are my bonds? There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When the executive finally spoke, the corporate veneer had cracked, replaced by the raw voice of a man watching his empire burn. David, they're not here. We don't have them. Chen felt the floor drop out from beneath him. What do you mean you don't have them? The executive's voice was barely a whisper. They were rehypothecated, pledged to our clearing banks for our own funding. Now those banks have a line on them. With our credit rating collapsing, they're seizing all the collateral they can. It's all frozen. It was the moment Chen had feared since he first read that contract. His client's assets, the bedrock of his fund, were not his to control. They were trapped, hostages in a war between Goliath and its own creditors. He had a legal claim, yes. He was the beneficial owner. But his claim was now just one among hundreds, a ticket to a years-long bankruptcy proceeding where he might, if he was lucky, recover pennies on the dollar. Goliath's philosophy of relentless efficiency had worked perfectly, until it didn't. In their quest to make every asset sweat, they had created a system so interconnected and leveraged that the failure of a single part caused the entire machine to seize. Chen hung up the phone and looked out at his own trading floor. His team was watching him, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. He had built his firm on the promise of safety, of prudent stewardship. He had followed all the rules. He had signed the standard agreements. He had played the game. And yet, because of a single clause, his client's future was now tied to the fate of a collapsing giant over which he had no control. He thought back to that conference call years ago, the smooth voice on the other end assuring him that this was all just market standard. He now understood the brutal truth. Market standard was a euphemism for systemic risk, and the cost of that risk was never paid by the Goliaths who created it, but by the Davids who were forced to play in their arena. The phone on his desk began to scream again. It was his clients, calling to ask if their money was safe. For the first time in his career, he did not have an answer. To understand Goliath's actions, we must step inside their walls a year before the collapse. The mood in the steel and glass tower was not one of reckless abandon, but of supreme, data-driven confidence. In a 40th floor conference room, a young risk analyst named Sarah Jennings was presenting to the global head of prime brokerage, a man named Jacobson, whose entire career was built on the gospel of capital efficiency. On the screen behind her was a complex, color-coded diagram that looked like a star chart. Each point of light was a client, like David Chen's Keystone Capital. Each line connecting them was a strand in the vast web of rehypothecation. As you can see, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the intimidating audience, collateral velocity is at an all-time high. We are effectively using every dollar of client collateral to generate returns, either through securities lending or by pledging it to secure our own short-term funding. She clicked to the next slide, a simplified animation. It showed a block of bonds labeled Keystone Capital, entering Goliath's system.a. Instantly, it was bundled with assets from a dozen other funds, relabeled GDB, Collateral Pool 7, and shot across a digital pipeline to another, larger bank in London. From there, the pool was broken up again, its component parts pledged out to secure various trades. My concern, Sarah said, pointing to the screen, is the interconnectedness and the underlying quality of the collateral chains. We're accepting asset-backed securities from one fund, which are rated AAA, and rehypothecating them to secure our own financing. The entire chain assumes that AAA rating is infallible. Our stress tests, however, show that in a severe housing market downturn, the value of that collateral could fall by 40%, while its rating barely moves. The chain doesn't just bend, it shatters. We would be unable to recall and segregate assets in a timely manner. The entire system would freeze. She looked directly at Jacobson. We are creating a liquidity machine that has no emergency brake. Jacobson leaned back in his chair, a thin smile on his face. He saw not risk, but beauty. A perfectly optimized system. Sarah, this is an excellent academic exercise, but you're modeling for an apocalypse that the market says isn't coming. Are you telling me your little model is smarter than the entire global ratings agency apparatus? These assets are AAA. That is the gold standard. And look at these numbers. He gestured to a different chart showing the prime brokerage division's profits, a line that went almost vertically upward. This liquidity machine, as you call it, is funding a significant portion of the bank's balance sheet at a cost far below any other source. This is the engine. Rehypothecation is the fuel. Your job is to tell me the engine's temperature. My job is to win the race. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. The old model of banking was a warehouse. You took a client's assets, you put them in a box, and you charged them a fee for storage. It was safe, sleepy, and inefficient. We are not a warehouse. We are a conduit. Assets flow through us. They don't stop. We extract value from the flow. We provide liquidity. We lower costs for everyone, and we get paid for managing the complexity. David Chen doesn't want his bonds sitting in a box. He wants the low financing rates that our efficiency provides. He just doesn't want to think about how we provide them. He turned back to Sarah. Your model is a ghost story, a fascinating one, but not one we're going to run the business by. Keep monitoring. The meeting was over. Dejected, Sarah returned to her desk. Her department head, a veteran risk manager named Frank who was just a few years from retirement, came over and leaned against her cubicle wall. Tough room? He asked, not needing an answer. Frank, he's not listening, Sarah said, gesturing to her screen. The risk isn't theoretical, it's building. Frank sighed, a sound of profound weariness. Kid, you did your job. You wrote the memo. You ran the numbers. You presented your findings. Now, you file the memo in the shared drive under CYA. Jacobson's bonus last year was bigger than our entire department's annual budget. Whose side do you think the board is on? The guy generating 9-figure profits or the analyst with a scary spreadsheet? He patted her on the shoulder. In this business, you learn that you're not paid to prevent the fire. You're paid to document with precision the exact reasons the building burned down. The motive was clear. It wasn't malice, it was momentum. It was the relentless, systemic pressure for returns in a low-margin world. Goliath, and every other bank like them, had built a system where the small, distributed risk of thousands of clients like David Chen was gathered, concentrated, and transformed into a single, massive, and ultimately fatal systemic risk. The profits were Goliath's to keep. The risk, they had unknowingly socialized across the entire financial world. The catastrophe was now a mathematical certainty, just waiting for a trigger. The central conflict is a battle over the very soul of the financial system. Is a bank a fortress of stone and steel, a secure warehouse where assets are guarded? Or is it a conduit of glass and light, a dynamic network where assets must constantly flow to generate maximum value? For decades, the fortress model dominated. It was slow, expensive, and relatively safe. David Chen's philosophy of capital preservation was a product of this older world. But the rise of globalized high-speed finance saw the conduit model triumph. Goliath Global Bank was its high priest. In their worldview, An asset sitting still was a liability, an inefficiency to be eliminated. This philosophy was not just a preference, it was an existential necessity in a world of razor-thin margins and ferocious competition. The true danger arose when this ideology of efficiency was combined with a global patchwork of inconsistent regulations. The rules governing rehypothecation were not uniform. In the United States, regulations placed a hard cap on the practice. A broker could only reuse client collateral up to a value of 140% of the client's loan. This created a mathematical limit on the length of the collateral chain, a built-in firebreak. But in the United Kingdom, the rules were far more permissive. Before the crisis, there was effectively no limit. A broker in London could take a client's assets and rehypothecate them over and over, creating potentially infinite leverage from a finite base of collateral. This was not an academic distinction. It was a critical feature of the global financial architecture that created a powerful incentive for regulatory arbitrage. Hedge funds like Keystone Capital, even those based in New York, were actively encouraged to sign their prime brokerage agreements with the London-based international arms of banks like Goliath. The choice was presented not as a gamble on legal systems, but as a simple optimization. Because the bank had unlimited use of the client's collateral in London, it could offer slightly better financing rates. 0.25 percentage point, a few basis points, these tiny differences, magnified by billions of dollars in assets, translated into millions in returns. David Chen, in his fiduciary duty to seek the best terms for his clients, was pushed by the inexorable logic of the market into the very jurisdiction that offered the weakest protections. He signed the London Agreement not out of recklessness, but because the system was designed to reward those who did. When Goliath Global Bank imploded, this seemingly minor contractual detail became the difference between recovery and ruin. Clients whose assets were held by Goliath's American entity, governed by the 140% rule, had a clearer and more senior claim in the bankruptcy. They stood a chance of getting a significant portion of their collateral back through a painful but orderly process. But clients like Chen, whose assets were held by the London entity, were thrown into a chaotic legal black hole. Their bonds had been repledged so many times, to so many different counterparties under so many different agreements, that untangling the web of ownership was a near impossible task. They found themselves at the back of a very long line, behind the largest banks in the world who were Goliath's own senior creditors. The stakes of this legalistic nightmare were brutally human. The $2 billion in bonds on Keystone Capital's books were not an abstract number. They were the collective retirement savings of a state teacher's pension fund, the sum of quiet contributions from 1,000 paychecks over 30 years of service, the financial security of thousands of educators who had traded lower salaries for the promise of a stable retirement, was now a line item in a London bankruptcy court, being fought over by armies of lawyers. The failure of the conduit model was not just a financial event, it was a societal one. It was the breaking of a fundamental promise. A demonstration that the relentless pursuit of efficiency in an opaque and underregulated system could vaporize the life savings of people who had never even heard the word rehypothecation. The battle between the fortress and the conduit was over, and the ruins of the conduit had crushed the people the fortress was meant to protect. In the aftermath, the conflict transitioned from the chaos of the market to the cold theater of a congressional hearing room. Jacobson, the architect of Goliath's prime brokerage empire, sat before a panel of lawmakers, a portrait of unflappable corporate composure. His defense was a polished narrative of systemic failure, a story in which Goliath was not the antagonist, but merely another casualty. Rehypothecation is the bedrock of market liquidity, he declared, his tone measured and educational. It is a standard industry practice, fully disclosed, that reduces costs for all market participants. The unfortunate events that transpired were the result of a once-in-a-century market event, a perfect storm that no reasonable model could have predicted. He was casting the collapse as an act of God, not an act of the bank. Watching the broadcast from a makeshift office, David Chen felt a cold fury solidify within him. Jacobson was weaponizing complexity, using the jargon of finance as a shield to hide a simple truth. Chen resolved to dismantle this defense, not with rhetoric, but with receipts. He would use Goliath's own words, their own data, to expose the lie. The methodical deconstruction began with a glossy marketing brochure. In a later deposition, Chen's lawyer handed the brochure to Jacobson. "Mr. Jacobson, you recognize this document? It's your marketing material for the Global Prime Gateway program." Jacobson nodded. "I do." The lawyer pointed to a highlighted section. "Please read the line under the heading, Unlocking Your Portfolio's Potential." Jacobson read, his voice devoid of inflection. "Leverage dormant assets to generate enhanced returns and achieve unparalleled capital efficiency." The lawyer leaned forward slightly. A powerful promise, yet the word rehypothecation appears nowhere in these 12 pages, nor is there any mention of the risk that those dormant assets might not be returned. Is that correct? Jacobson's posture stiffened. The operative legal terms are detailed in the Master Services Agreement. This is a summary document. The trap was set. The strike followed immediately. Chen's legal team had unearthed the internal memos from Sarah Jennings' Risk Division. A slide appeared on the large screen, displaying a paragraph from an email Jennings had sent to Jacobson's top deputy. The date was from the previous year. It read, "The concentration of rehypothecated assets pledged to our UK entity represents a critical point of failure. In a market stress scenario, a ratings-driven margin call would create an immediate and potentially insurmountable liquidity shortfall, making the return of client collateral impossible." A murmur went through the room. The lawyer's voice was sharp. "Mr. Jacobson, this is not a hypothetical model. This is a specific warning about a specific practice. Was this risk not, in fact, foreseen?" Jacobson waved a dismissive hand. "We receive hundreds of such warnings. Risk management is about probabilities, not certainties. We judge the probability of this scenario to be remote." The act of God defense was now exposed as a calculated risk. The final blow was aimed at the heart of Jacobson's argument, that the system benefited everyone. Chen's team had conducted a forensic audit, and the result was displayed on a new slide, a simple bar chart. One bar, colored blue, showed the average annual financing cost savings passed to a client like Keystone Capital. It was a sliver. Next to it, a towering red bar represented the annual profit Goliath's trading desk generated by using that same client collateral for its own purposes. The disparity was grotesque. The lawyer let the image sink in before speaking. "Mr. Jacobson, does this chart accurately reflect the distribution of benefits from your capital efficiency program?" All the composure was gone. Jacobson stared at the screen, cornered by his own bank's data. Chen had proven his case. The system wasn't designed to lower costs for everyone. It was designed to transfer risk from Goliath to its clients, while funneling the rewards directly back to Goliath. Jacobson, backed into a corner by his own data, executed a masterful pivot. He abandoned the argument of ignorance and adopted one of systemic inevitability, a defense that sought to dissolve Goliath's specific guilt into a general, industry-wide malaise. Every major financial institution on the street offered similar terms, he argued, his voice regaining its authoritative cadence. "We exist in a fiercely competitive global environment. Had we unilaterally imposed the kind of restrictive, American-style covenants Mr. Chen now advocates for our clients and the capital they represent would have simply taken their business to our competitors in London, Zurich, or Frankfurt. We were not the authors of these global rules. We were merely one of the players in a game with an established board." It was a sophisticated argument, shifting the blame from Goliath to the entire system, and implicitly to the regulators who had allowed such a fragmented system to exist. This was the defense Chen had spent months preparing for. The argument that Goliath was just a passive participant, a leaf carried along by the currents of competition. His next attack was designed to prove they were not just a leaf in the stream. They were the engineers who had dynamited the riverbed to change its course. The setup began with a new set of documents, Goliath's federal lobbying disclosures, dry government filings that tracked the flow of corporate influence. Chen's lawyer placed a summary on the projector. It detailed over $10 million in spending over 5 years, directed at a handful of key committees overseeing financial regulation. The strike was surgical. "Mr. Jacobson, these records show your firm's registered lobbyists held no fewer than 53 meetings with senior regulators and congressional staff. The topic of discussion listed for 40 of those meetings was capital requirements and global competitiveness. Can you confirm for this committee that in these meetings, your firm argued strongly against extending US-style limits on rehypothecation to the international subsidiaries of American banks, claiming it would put our financial institutions at a severe competitive disadvantage? The reaction was a palpable tightening in Jacobson's jaw. He was being confronted with the hidden machinery of his bank's power. We, like any corporation, advocate for our positions in the public square. We believe, and still believe, that prescriptive overregulation stifles liquidity and ultimately harms the economy by making credit more expensive. He was trying to frame it as a noble matter of economic principle, but the revelation hung in the air. Goliath wasn't just playing by the rules. They were spending millions to keep those rules weak and full of holes. The final decisive blow came not from a government filing, but from Goliath's own internal strategy playbook. Chen's team had acquired the training materials given to the bank's elite relationship managers, the ones who courted the world's largest hedge funds. The lawyer put up a slide from a PowerPoint presentation. The title of the slide was Optimizing Client Domicile for Collateral Velocity. Below the title were two columns. One, labeled US Agreement, listed the 140% rehypothecation limit as a revenue constraint and a client friction point. The other column, labeled UK Agreement, listed unlimited rehypothecation as a key competitive advantage and a profit center maximizer. A bullet point below instructed salespeople on how to frame the UK agreement as a more sophisticated and efficient option for truly global funds. The lawyer's voice was cold and precise. Mr. Jacobson, this isn't a legal disclosure or a policy debate. This is a sales strategy. Your bank actively trained its staff to identify and exploit a regulatory loophole, steering American clients toward London agreements not for the client's benefit, but to maximize your bank's ability to use their assets. You didn't just participate in a flawed system, you built a highly profitable business model around its biggest flaw. Is that not correct? There was no answer. Jacobson stared at the slide, a perfect damning summary of his division's core philosophy, now being used as an indictment against him. The document proved, unequivocally, that Goliath's actions were not a reluctant concession to market forces, but a deliberate predatory strategy. They had identified a weakness in the global financial armor and systematically exploited it for profit, fully aware of the risks, because the rules they had helped write allowed them to. The fight was over. Chen hadn't just proven Goliath was responsible, he had proven they were the architects of their own, and his, destruction. Jacobson, his corporate defenses shattered, retreated to his final fortress, the high ground of ideological necessity. He looked not at the lawyer, but directly at the committee chairman, recasting himself as a misunderstood titan of industry. What Mr. Chen and his counsel fail to appreciate, he began, his voice taking on the air of a weary professor, is that the system they are so quick to condemn is the very engine of global prosperity. The liquidity and efficiency generated by practices like rehypothecation are not abstract concepts. They are what finance the innovation, the infrastructure, and the growth that benefits every single citizen. They want the fruits of a modern, dynamic financial system, but they are unwilling to accept the complex realities and calculated risks that make it possible. They are arguing for a return to a simpler, safer, and profoundly poorer world. It was a brilliant, almost unanswerable defense. He was framing Chen as a Luddite, a man trying to smash a machine he didn't understand, a machine that, for all its flaws, had made everyone richer. He was daring the committee to dismantle the engine of capitalism itself. But Chen had anticipated this final gambit. He knew Jacobson's last stand would be a philosophical one, and he had prepared a response that was brutally, devastatingly personal. The setup was the quietest of the day. Chen's lawyer walked slowly to the witness table and placed a single final document in front of Jacobson. It was not from Goliath's archives. Mr. Bonds. Jacobson, the lawyer said. This is a copy of the custodial agreement for your own personal and family trust accounts, held at a private bank in Geneva. Is that correct? Jacobson's eyes darted down at the paper, a flicker of genuine surprise and perhaps fear crossing his face. This is a private matter. It has no bearing on these proceedings. The chairman intervened. The committee has deemed it relevant, Mr. Jacobson. Please answer the question. Jacobson's voice was clipped. Yes. The strike was delivered with surgical precision. The lawyer directed everyone's attention to the main screen, where a single paragraph from the agreement was now displayed in large, clear type. It was a custom clause heavily negotiated. The lawyer read it aloud. Under no circumstances shall the custodian bank be permitted to use, pledge, repledicate, rehypothecate, lend or otherwise encumber any assets held within the accounts. All securities must be maintained in a fully segregated, non-commingled custodial capacity. The lawyer let the words hang in the silent room for a long moment before turning back to the witness. Mr. Jacobson, the lawyer's voice was now soft, but it cut through the room like a razor. You have spent this entire hearing lecturing this committee on the systemic importance and economic necessity of rehypothecation. You have dismissed Mr. Chen's concerns as naive nostalgia. Yet the record shows that for your own family's fortune, you demanded the very protections you denied your clients. You insisted on a fortress for your own wealth, while you forced everyone else to live in the conduit you built. It seems the simpler, safer world you so casually dismissed was not a fantasy you were willing to forgo for yourself. Can you explain to this committee why the system that was good enough for thousands of school teachers was not good enough for you? There was no answer. There was nothing left to say. Jacobson stared blankly at the screen, exposed not just as a reckless executive, but as a hypocrite of the highest order. He had preached the gospel of shared risk from the safety of his own personal bomb shelter. In that moment, the entire complex financial argument collapsed into a simple, damning moral truth. David Chen had not only won the argument, he had revealed the man behind the machine. The silence in the hearing room was a physical force, a vacuum that sucked all the air and argument out of the proceedings. The flashing of cameras was the only sound, a frantic, percussive counterpoint to Jacobson's utter stillness. He had no defense. There is no sophisticated economic theory, no appeal to market efficiency, that can explain away the raw, primal hypocrisy of demanding for oneself the very safety nets one rips away from others. The committee chairman, a veteran politician who had seen his share of corporate evasions, simply stared at Jacobson for a long moment before bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. This committee is in recess. It was a dismissal, not a pause. The takedown was complete, and its final act played out not in the hearing room, but across the global media landscape. Chen's final, devastating receipt had transformed the narrative. By nightfall, the story was no longer a complex debate about collateral velocity and regulatory arbitrage. It was now a simple, powerful, and infuriating tale of elite hypocrisy. Cable news chyrons screamed variations of the same theme, the banker's private fortress. Talk show hosts who couldn't pronounce rehypothecation were now making jokes about it. Jacobson had tried to portray Chen as a man who didn't understand the modern world. Chen had revealed Jacobson as a man who understood it so well. He had built a private escape hatch for himself while locking the doors on everyone else. The institutional reaction was swift and merciless. On a hastily convened, encrypted conference call, Goliath's board performed the grim calculus of survival. The legal counsel was blunt. Jacobson was no longer a key executive. He was a reputational anchor, dragging the entire firm to the bottom. The decision was unanimous. The bank, in a desperate act of self-preservation, issued a statement praising his years of service while simultaneously announcing a full, independent, and transparent internal investigation into the lapses of judgment within its prime brokerage division. They were sacrificing their general to save the army. The committee's final report was a scathing indictment, and its central annex contained in full the documents Chen's team had uncovered. The marketing brochures, the internal risk warnings, the lobbying disclosures, and the damning sales training PowerPoints. Sarah Jennings' ghost story had become the official history. For David Chen, however, there was no celebration. The public humiliation of one executive did not bring back his client's $2 billion. He watched the news reports from his office, the victory feeling like ash in his mouth. He had won the battle of the narrative, but the war for his client's capital was just beginning. It would be a grinding, multi-year slog through the opaque purgatory of international bankruptcy court. But the takedown in that hearing room was a critical, necessary victory. By systematically dismantling Goliath's wall of lies, he had established an undeniable record of fact. He had proven that the loss of his client's assets was not an accident, Not an act of God, not an unforeseeable tsunami. It was the direct, predictable, and internally documented result of a business strategy that privatized profit while socializing risk. The face of the crisis was no longer Jacobson's, but that of a woman named Helen Gable, the head of the Ohio Teachers Retirement Fund, one of David Chen's largest clients. A local news interview with her was picked up by the national networks and went viral. She wasn't a polished media figure. She was a former history teacher, and her anger was quiet, precise, and devastating. "For 30 years, she said, looking directly into the camera, her voice steady but laced with steel, we have told our members that a promise is a promise, that their deferred compensation, their security, is sacred. We entrusted that promise to Keystone Capital, who entrusted it to Goliath Bank, and we have now learned that to Goliath. That sacred promise was just another line of code in a profit algorithm. Mr. Jacobson wanted a fortress for his own money. He used our members' retirement security as the building materials for its walls. Her words, more than any politician's, galvanized the public. The $2 billion was no longer a statistic. It was the life's work of thousands of teachers, visualized as the bricks in a billionaire's private vault. Inside Goliath, the fallout was a quiet, suffocating purge. Sarah Jennings, the risk analyst whose warnings had been ignored, was called into a meeting with the bank's new interim head of risk. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't thank her. He slid a non-disclosure agreement across the table, along with a severance offer that was insultingly generous. The bank is moving in a new direction, he said, his voice flat. We value your contributions. This is a standard separation package. Sarah looked at the document, then at the man who represented the new, supposedly reformed Goliath. She didn't say a word. She stood up, left the agreement on the table, walked back to her desk, and began packing her belongings into a cardboard box. Her old boss, Frank, came over. You were right, kid, he said, his voice low. Yeah, Sarah replied, not looking at him. And it doesn't matter. She had been vindicated by the truth, but the truth had changed nothing about the soul of the institution. She was a Cassandra who was being paid handsomely to disappear. The market itself was rendering its own brutal verdict. The Jacobson clause became the new gold standard. Across the industry, hedge funds and institutional investors began a frantic renegotiation of their prime brokerage agreements. The demand was universal and non-negotiable. Full segregation of assets with an explicit, custom-drafted prohibition on rehypothecation. The very efficiency that Jacobson had championed was now being systematically dismantled by his former peers and clients in a mad scramble for safety. The conduit was being clogged, deliberately, by 1,000 hands. The cost of borrowing went up. Liquidity tightened. The system became slower, clunkier, and more expensive. It was the price of broken trust, a tax levied by fear. And David Chen, who had only ever wanted to quietly manage his clients' money, found himself transformed. He was no longer just a fund manager. He was a reluctant icon, the man who had pulled back the curtain. His phone rang constantly. It was other fund managers, asking for advice on their own legal battles. It was journalists asking for comment on the latest regulatory proposal. It was congressional staffers asking for his testimony on a new piece of legislation. He had started a fight to recover his clients' assets, but he had inadvertently launched a crusade for the soul of the system itself. The quiet, methodical man who believed in capital preservation had become the unwilling face of a revolution, a symbol of resistance against a machine he was still trying to escape. The cultural fallout was just as profound. In the months that followed, the story of Goliath and the Jacobson clause became a kind of modern fable, a shorthand for corporate greed and hypocrisy. A hit television drama about a maverick district attorney featured a storyline about a corrupt banker whose downfall came when the hero discovered his offshore accounts were fully segregated. The line was delivered with a knowing smirk, and audiences instantly understood the reference. In a blockbuster superhero movie, the villain wasn't a costume megalomaniac, but a smooth-talking CEO of a company called Goliath Trust, who was secretly rehypothecating alien technology, risking the planet for profit. Art was imitating life, cementing the scandal in the public consciousness. The story even bled into the world of music. A folk singer, known for his politically charged lyrics, released a protest song titled The Ballad of David Chen. Its haunting chorus became an anthem for the protest movement. The banker builds his fortress tall, with bricks he stole from me and you, and says the risk is for us all, but segregation's just for few. The song was played at rallies and shared online, a simple, powerful distillation of a complex financial crime into 3 minutes of acoustic outrage. In the academic world, the Goliath case became the new gold standard for business school ethics classes. The PowerPoint slide showing the U.S. constraint versus the UK advantage was now a permanent fixture in lectures on regulatory arbitrage. The tale of Sarah Jennings became a cautionary case study in corporate governance, a textbook example of what happens when a culture of profit systematically overrides the function of risk management. Business students were now taught not just how to build financial models, but how to recognize the organizational pathologies that lead to their collapse. Her famous memo was dissected and debated, a ghost now haunting the curriculum. Meanwhile, in the quiet, methodical world of bankruptcy court, the actual machinery of justice ground on fuel. The process was a brutal war of attrition. Goliath's army of lawyers fought every claim, delayed every disclosure, and appealed every ruling. They argued that the teacher's pension fund was a sophisticated investor that should have understood the risks inherent in a London-domiciled agreement. They argued that David Chen was an experienced manager who had signed a binding contract, and that his subsequent outrage was nothing more than buyer's remorse. They tried to drag the proceedings out for years, hoping to exhaust their smaller opponents into accepting a low-ball settlement of pennies on the dollar. But Chen, backed by the moral and financial support of the teacher's fund, refused to break. He countered every legal maneuver with the simple, undeniable evidence he had already presented to the world. He was no longer just fighting for the money. He was fighting for the precedent. And slowly, painstakingly, the tide began to turn. A key ruling from the judge affirmed that Goliath's deliberate and systematic exploitation of regulatory loopholes for its own enrichment constituted a breach of its fiduciary duty. It was a landmark decision, one that pierced the corporate veil of standard market practice. It was a signal that the rules of the game were, finally, beginning to change. The fallout was no longer just noise. It was beginning to have teeth. The ultimate fates of the key players became a subject of intense public fascination, tracked on blogs and financial news sites like a grim spectator sport bio. Jacobson, having resigned with a golden parachute worth north of $50 million, disappeared from public life. 6 months after the hearing, a paparazzo snapped a long-lens photo of him on the deck of a super yacht in the Caribbean. The picture, showing him laughing with a drink in his hand, went viral instantly. The caption that spread with it was simple and acidic: Jacobson enjoying his fully segregated retirement. He faced no criminal charges. The fines levied against Goliath were paid by the company, not by him. He had lost his job and his reputation, but he had kept his fortune, a fact that became a permanent Exhibit A in the public's case against the justice system. Goliath Global Bank, deemed too big to fail, did not die. It was bailed out, restructured, and rebranded. The name Goliath was quietly retired, replaced by a bland, reassuring name like Global Trust and Commerce. A new CEO was brought in, a woman with a reputation as a reformer who gave a series of carefully managed interviews about the bank's new culture of responsibility and client focus. The prime brokerage division was downsized, its sales materials rewritten by armies of lawyers. The glass tower remained, a monument to the idea that institutions, unlike people, could be too big to be held accountable. For the Ohio Teachers Retirement Fund, the fight ended not with a bang but with a settlement. After 2 years of brutal legal trench warfare, armed with the leverage of public opinion and damning court rulings, David Chen forced a deal. The pension fund recovered 85 cents on the dollar. Dart. In the world of complex financial bankruptcies, it was a stunning, almost miraculous victory. Helen Gable, in her final press conference on the matter, was pragmatic. "It is not whole," she said, "but it is more than we ever thought we would see. It is enough. Our promise to our members, while damaged, is not broken." The most lasting impact was etched into the law itself. Spurred by the public outcry and the undeniable evidence of systemic failure, regulators in the US and Europe worked together to harmonize their rules. The UK loophole that allowed for unlimited rehypothecation was slammed shut. The American 140% limit, or variations of it, became the new global standard. The Jacobson Clause, the explicit prohibition of rehypothecation, became a boilerplate demand in institutional client agreements worldwide. The very practices that Goliath had perfected were now largely illegal. The conduit had been lined with concrete. The final, enduring image of the fallout was a meme that appeared a year after the settlement. It was a split screen. On the left was the photo of Jacobson on his yacht, a symbol of consequence-free failure. On the right was a photo of a smiling Helen Gable, cutting a ribbon at the opening of a new elementary school library, funded in part by the recovered pension money. There was no caption. None was needed. It was the perfect, bittersweet epilogue to the scandal. The villain gets away, but the hero, through a relentless and costly fight, manages to salvage a measure of justice from the wreckage, turning a financial abstraction back into a tangible public good. The legacy of the Goliath scandal is a system with new guardrails, but the same engine. The rules on rehypothecation changed, closing the most dangerous loopholes. Yet the core temptation remains, to make $1 do the work of many. The battle between David Chen and Jacobson was a fight over one kind of financial illusion, the idea that an asset could be in two places at once. But this concept of layered ownership, where what you think you own is not what you actually control, exists throughout the modern market. It's at the heart of the most popular investment products in the world today. To see how a dollar invested into an ETF doesn't always translate into a dollar buying the underlying stock, watch our next investigation. Open the on-screen card now for ETF Flows 101. Money in ETFs, UNE and assets.